All right, so we want to focus on the VO2 because the VO2 max and VO2 in general is very important because it's a measurement of your cardiac function, your pulmonary efficiency, your vascular delivery, your skeletal muscle and oxidative capacity, even down to your mitochondrial health. It does it all in once. And really, if there's anything that you could put into like one physiology variable that best captures your overall cardiorespiratory fitness, it would be your VO2 max. And it's because your cardiorespiratory fitness is not just, it's not only the strongest predictor of all-cause mortality, but that VO2 max also becomes really important for a performance metric as well and overall health. So let's start with basically defining VO2, all right? So VO2, and there's actually a dot over here, and that's because we're talking about the consumption. It's the volume of VO2 that's being consumed. It's the rate of O2 consumption. That's really what it is. So it's the rate of O2 consumption. And it's going to be measured in milliliters per minute per kilogram. Okay, that's relative. Or in just liters per minute. And that would be absolute. And this is important because, see, with the relative way, you're able to compare people of different body sizes, right? So if it's relative, it's per minute per kilogram, versus the absolute is, as it says, it's the absolute amount that you can actually get. And this is important because, again, if we're thinking about it's the rate of the maximal amount of oxygen you can actually use. Remember, in the mitochondria, that's where we use the oxygen. So if you have a lot of functioning mitochondria and you have a strong heart so you can get all that oxygen to the mitochondria, then you can consume a lot more oxygen than somebody else can. And you kind of want to look at both numbers, the per kilogram as well as the absolute. Because as an example, we have tables showing what somebody's relative VO2 max should be for them to be, in poor health, good health, excellent health, superior, elite, champion, and so on. Well, you can imagine that if you have somebody who basically has really, really low muscle mass, all right? They're just like skin and bones, or maybe they're fat and bones. And they measure their VO2 max, and it's like, 2.5 or 3 or something. And yet, because they hardly weigh anything at all, their relative VO2 max seems pretty high. So they're told, hey, you're healthy. You're like the average person. But yet they can hardly run a mile, or let alone a 5K with any decent time. Right? That's going to be problematic because they're thinking they're healthy when they're really not. That's why looking at the absolute VO2 is also important. You can have the other spectrum where, a really fit bodybuilder who does good cardio, but yet because they weigh a lot, they look at their VO2 and it's like, you're kind of average, you're not so good, but actually their absolute VO2 is super high, and if you took that into consideration, you would say this person has a really high cardiorespiratory fitness. And that's why things like the mile run or mile and a half run, 5K performance, these are also really strong predictors of your VO2 max, your cardiorespiratory fitness. But the thing is those races like a 5K or a mile, they go a lot into specificity, your running economy, and a number of other things too. So it's difficult to just go, oh, this is the gold standard, this is the gold standard, or whatever, because there's these variables. But when it comes to cardiorespiratory fitness in general, measuring VO2 really is the gold standard. I mean, it really is the most amount of oxygen that you can consume to support your oxidative phosphorylation, right? So that's the VO2 max, and it's again how much you can achieve during when your whole body is being measured. And essentially, then that would mean it's the functional ceiling, if you will, of your aerobic capacity to do ATP production through the mitochondria. And that's probably why it's considered a gold standard for cardiorespiratory fitness. Like I said, it's a strong predictor of your endurance performance, and it's a powerful predictor of mortality and health span. So those with a high VO2 max, they're going to be able to perform better. We'll talk more about this. I mean, just because you have a high VO2 max doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the marathon. That's to win the marathon or these races, you do have to have a high VO2 max. But in the end, it comes down to like running economy and the percent. There's a number of things with that. But that VO2 max is really important. And to really put this home, let's talk about what's known as the Fick equation. Okay. This, I think, will be very useful in our discussion, okay? What is the Fick equation? The Fick equation is how we can measure the VO2. So the VO2 is going to be equal to Q, which is that's the cardiac output. And then we can multiply this times the content of arterial O2 minus the content of venous O2, and that's it. That's as simple as it is. That's the very elegant equation. We could just simplify this. Not really simplified, but we could just go VO2 will be equal to Q times the AVO2 difference. Now, arterial, like I said, the arterial and venous oxygen difference, right? That's the extraction difference. Now, let's break this equation up and we can start to really understand the physiology behind why this is such a critical determinant and marker of cardiorespiratory fitness, right? So Q. What is Q? Q stands for the cardiac output. And cardiac output is two things together. It's the stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. Okay, that's all that it is. Now, let's look about what about the heart rate? Well, an untrained heart rate, what is an untrained heart rate per, like, just in resting conditions, right? For an untrained person. So at rest, they're going to be between, let's say, 60 to 80 beats per minute. And then let's say that a trained person, who's actually training, they're going to be lower. They're going to have slight bradycardia. Okay, maybe they're going to be 45 to 55 beats per minute. And then you can have your elite athletes, and they're going to be even lower, like 30 to 45 beats per minute. So this is at rest. Okay. Now let's talk about what about at max? Okay, so like max exercise. Well, what would that heart rate be? Well, actually, their max heart rate, it doesn't really change very much. Max heart rate is typically around, we'll just go 220 minus your age, right? So if you're 40 years old, 220, so 20 years old, 220 minus your age, so 200, if you're 40, so 220 minus 40, 180 beats per minute. This is just an age-predicted calculator here. There's better ones. That's fine. Really, you can just measure it on your own, right? Push yourself out to your max heart rate and see where you're really at, because there can be quite high intervariability or between different people. Where actually, like with training, for example, as you train, like elite athletes, their max heart rate typically tends to go down. So if anything, it's going to either going to be unchanged, or it's going to slightly decrease with that endurance training. And also, like with age, as you get older, that's why age is in here. That's, I'll just say equals max heart rate. As you get older, right, your max heart rate tends to decrease with that. And the reason for these changes, though, with your max heart rate in general is just because you have the intrinsic pacemaker is being remodeled basically. You also have like beta adrenergic receptors responsiveness and your age-related sinus node changes as well. So there's a number of things that are responsible for this. Now when it comes to, that's the heart rate side. Now it comes to the stroke volume. This isn't going to be an important one. The stroke volume is really the most important part of all of this, because you will find out that Q is really what drives the VO2 max. And stroke volume is really what drives Q. So Q ends up being extremely important. So what makes up the stroke volume? Well, stroke volume is like this. So basically you have your end diastolic volume, because it's really just a thing between filling and emptying. So you have end diastolic volume, and you have your minus your end systolic volume. Okay, that's all that's all you look at. So you're emptying and you're filling. So let's talk about your end diastolic volume then. So when it comes to the thing about your ventricles, for example, this is all about things like your venous return, how much blood volume you have. Again, with a trained athlete, you're going to have higher blood volume. Your plasma volume is going to be higher. You have better ventricular compliance. You have better, diastolic filling time. It goes fast. Your diastolic filling time is going to be improved as well. Even as you're exercising, your skeletal muscles are helping to pump the blood up to your heart as well, so you can have more end diastolic volume. And so like the skeletal muscle pump, and of course the respiratory pump as well. Again, it's also pushing that in there. So again, as you're training, you have increased plasma volume. You're going to have an increased chamber size of your left ventricle. That's going to be larger. And you're going to have an increased compliance as well. You'll have more preload, right? So all this is going to improve your end diastolic volume, right? And now we have the end systolic volume. Okay, well, this is basically what remains after the contraction, right? So after the left ventricle, squeeze all that blood out, what's remaining? And that's going to depend on the contractility of the heart muscles, the afterload, as well as the sympathetic drive. So of course, as you're training, then you're going to have this right here with training. Okay, so if I put training is going to increase your end diastolic volume. And for this one, it's going to lead to a decrease in your end systolic volume, right? Because again, you're improving your contractility. You're having a stronger ejection fraction. And so it's going to get your end systolic volume. Okay, so now we've talked about rest over here. How about rest with the stroke volume? What is that going to be? So for an untrained individual, so let's go rest, and we'll do the untrained person. How many milliliters of blood is being pumped? This could be, anywhere from 60 to 90 milliliters of blood being pumped per contraction, right? And now for the trained individual, what about them? Well, that's going to be about 90 to 120 milliliters. So big difference right there. Now your elite is where things get crazy. We're talking about 120 to, over 160, over 160 plus milliliters per minute. Now that's at rest. So now what about at maximal exercise? Because this is at rest. So we'll talk about the cardiac output here in a second. Okay. So now during your exercise, we'll say max. Okay, max exercise. How much does a normal untrained person's cardiac output go? Oh, now they're at max exercise, so it can be like 100 to say 120 milliliters, per beat. Then your trained person, maybe it goes up to 140 to 180 milliliters per minute. So still, that's good. And then your elites, again, super impressive, right? We're talking about 180 to even over 220 milliliters. That's how high their stroke volume was getting at maximal exercise. So now we can calculate what the cardiac output is, right? What is a typical Q when you're at rest? Well, you have about 5 liters of blood. Okay, so you have 5 liters of blood in your body, right? On average, an average person, an elite athlete will have more than that, maybe like 6, 7 liters, which is really important to get. Again, as I talked about over here, with training, you can increase end-diastolic volume because you can increase your blood volume. But we just want to use 5 liters per minute because we want all this math is going to work out. So at rest, it's all about 5 liters per minute. So for example, if you go, let's say this person is around 70. Okay, so let's say at rest, 70 milliliters per beat, and let's say the heart rate is 70. So times 70 beats per minute. And what would that equal? 70 times 70 is 4,900 or milliliters, or about rounded to 5,000 milliliters or 5 liters, right? So about 5 liters per minute. So they're basically, an average person will have a cardiac output. Well, all people have a cardiac output at rest about 5 liters per minute, but this is how the rest person does it. Now we can do something a little bit different, like let's say that with the elite person, right? We'll say theirs is 140 milliliters. We know this has to equal 5 liters per minute. So what will their heart rate be? Right? They're just at rest, so they don't need to have their hearts that go boom, boom, like pumping everything. You only need 5 liters of blood per minute. So what does their heart rate have to be, right? 140 times what equals 5 liters? Well, it's going to be half of the 70, so 35. And that's why a lot of your elite athletes will have rest and heart rates around 35 beats per minute. Because you only need 35 beats per minute so that you can still get your 5 liter per minute cardiac output because you have such a high stroke volume, right? This is also why, think about how much little your heart has to now work just because it's not beating like so constantly, right? It's getting so tired like that. Just one nice, just pumps, good stroke volume, and you're able to get your full 5 liters, right? So that's what happens at rest. Now let's go to exercise. What happens at exercise? Okay, so this was at rest. Okay, now let's talk about at exercise. What's going to happen? Well, if we do max exercise, we can put these same things together. So heart rate, somebody's max heart rate, right? If we do, well, let's say that they're 20 years old. Okay, so they have a max heart rate of 200. Actually, if we keep things, so let's say that they're an untrained individual. They're doing a max effort, and we'll say it's 100 milliliters for their stroke volume during max exercise because they're just really not healthy. And let's say that they are max heart rate. Let's say they're 20 years old, and so the max heart rate is 200 beats per minute. And what does that equal? So 100 times 200 equals 200, and that is going to be equal to 20 liters per minute. All right? That's the untrained, unfit individual. Now, you can do the math. What happens if remember, heart rate can stay the same. Heart rate can stay the same on all of these. So 200 here, then we can go to the elite, so 200 right here. But we can increase, and we can put 140 right here. And we can put we can even put 200 right here. Why don't we do that? We can put 200, and let's do this middle one, we do 150. So if we put these ones together, we'd end up getting about 30 liters per minute. And this one we would get 200 times 200 would be 40,000. So 40 liters per minute. And that's why the trained elite athlete has such a higher cardiac output than the untrained because their stroke volume is so high. Again, the max heart rate is about the same. If anything, the max heart rate for the elite could probably be a little bit lower than that just because of the training effect that's happened, all right? So this here, as we're breaking out this Fick equation, this Q right here is sort of the central aspect, okay? So we do central, and this is going to be important when we start talking about what are they limited centrally or are they limited peripherally, like at the mitochondrial level, the extraction level. And there's a couple points I want you to consider with this. Remember, with a Q, the biggest thing is what? For the cardiac output, it is a stroke volume. What makes up the stroke volume? It is the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume. As you train, you're going to get more plasma, more blood protein. There's going to be more hemoglobin, for example. All of these, because hemoglobin, of course, carries the oxygen, which we talk about here, but we talk about it here also because as you have a higher blood volume, a higher plasma volume, then your end diastolic volume goes up, right? You have all these remodeling of the heart, improved left ventricle, less, more compliance and so on. So this is going to be the biggest factor right here, and that's going to most quickly improve somebody's VO2 max. Okay, now I want to spend some time on this aspect of the equation, all right? This is basically just the AVO2 difference, arterial to venous oxygen difference. Now, when we inhale oxygen, or we'll inhale air, there's oxygen in the air, around 21%. And we can actually calculate how much oxygen there is in the blood per deciliter. All right, so let's talk about that. This is really, it says difference because we want to know how much can we actually extract. Okay, so let's look at the content of, I'm going to just kind of go like this so we don't get confused. Let's look at the content of arterial oxygen. How do we figure that out? What is the actual calculation for that? Well, we use this 1.34 factor. This is like the Hufner constant, basically, that says that for every gram of saturated hemoglobin, it carries about 1.34 milliliters of oxygen. That's where this comes up, okay? And so we can take this and we multiply it by the amount of hemoglobin that's in our blood cells. And then the hemoglobin is going to be saturated with a certain amount of oxygen, right? So it's going to be a percent saturated. So we times that by, we just do the SaO2. All right, so 1.34 times the hemoglobin times how much it's saturated by. That's going to be this part. And now there's going to be a little bit more oxygen that's going to be dissolved in the blood. And so we can add that. And this is based upon the partial pressure. So we go 0.003 based upon, that's actually about how much oxygen gas is in there. And multiply that by the PaO2. Okay, so we can figure out what this is. So this is always with 1.34. The hemoglobin typically is going to be around 15 or so. Now that can change, 14 to 18, but it's a concentration. So you can say, oh, elite athletes are going to have higher hemoglobin levels. They do, but they have higher total hemoglobin mass because their blood volume actually increased, all right? Because if you have an increased, I'm going to put here BV, if you have an increased blood volume or plasma volume, then your end diastolic volume goes up. But you also are able to have more hemoglobin and then it doesn't get diluted. So hemoglobin levels can stay pretty much the same. Now, like blood doping and erythropoiesis and things, that could increase that and that could be somewhat problematic. You have thicker blood and that could be, potentially, I said problematic. It is problematic. But we can just keep 15 for what we're doing here. And then the SaO2, that is how much of that is saturated. And typically it's going to be around 98%. Okay, so 98% of that ends up being saturated. And when we do this math, so 1.34 times 15 times 98%, and then we add this part here. This is the amount of oxygen is pretty much, that's going to be dissolved in our blood. PaO2 is the partial pressure of oxygen at the arterial side, so it's going to be 100. So 100 times 0.003 ends up being 0.3. So if this is 100 millimeters of mercury, then this part becomes 0.3 milliliters per deciliter. And then this here ends up being around 20 milliliters per deciliter. And then plus a 0.3, I mean, it's pretty much meaningless, right? The hemoglobin is carrying around 20 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter. That means, in other words, what does that mean? It means that there is 20 milliliters of blood for every 100 milliliters of blood. Or, I like it to say that means there's 200 milliliters of oxygen per 1 liter of blood. All right, but typically in physiology, we just stick with this 20 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter. This is an important consideration too, because, so again, this amount here, you have about 0.3 milliliters of oxygen that's dissolved in your blood. It's essentially meaningless. It doesn't help very much at all. And that's, compared to your 20 milliliters, it's not going to do very much. And this also helps to explain why most people are not going to benefit from inhaling extra oxygen, like increasing the fraction of inspired oxygen from 21% to, 28, 30, 50%. Why? Because you're only going to marginally change this. This is what matters right here. This is what makes a big difference. All right, we'll talk more about this here in a little bit, but just keep that in mind. We really want to be focusing on this part here, okay? Now, let's talk about this extraction, because this is really what we want to talk about, the difference between the arterial and the venous side of things. Now, typically, at rest, so what is if we just go here, so we're focused here now on the VO₂ difference, okay? Now, under resting conditions, what is that? Well, typically your arterial side, you're going to have around 20. All right? And how about on your venous side? Your venous side, you're going to be around 15. Okay? 15 milliliters per deciliter. So that means your delta is going to be only around 5 milliliters per deciliter. Does that make sense? So at rest, your arterial side has 20 milliliters, and you extract about 5 milliliters because your venous side has about 15 milliliters in there, and so you've only extracted about 5 milliliters. Okay. Now during max exercise, that can change a little bit. Actually, quite a bit. Again, so exercise, we still have 20 milliliters per deciliter. And in this case, you can go down to, you can, if it's in the working muscles, we'll say you go down to, say, 2 milliliters. And so that means that our delta is going to be equal to 18 milliliters per deciliter. All right? So this is what can happen during max exercise. But this is really closer to like an elite level person, an elite athlete. If this is an elite, okay, but a normal person, so this is an elite, a normal person would probably be only extract this down to, say, 12 milliliters per minute, or per deciliter. Okay. In that case, yeah, they're only going to be around, say, 8 milliliters per deciliter. Okay. This is the sedentary. So the AVO2 difference makes a pretty big difference between the sedentary person and the elite individual, right? The delta of this delta right here of being 8 versus 18, right? And it could be, and the elite could essentially extract all of that oxygen when in the active working muscles, when that blood is going through the capillaries, it could extract all of that. But typically, when we're looking at we're measuring the mixed venous end, so it's typically higher, like 2 to 4, 6, or something like that, because it's all mixed, right? So again, at rest, it's 5 milliliters per minute, and then at maximal exercise, it can be quite a bit higher. So this really starts to explain the peripheral side of things, okay? I guess, so this was central. So here, this is the peripheral side of things in this portion, okay? And the reason why is because of this extraction. How do we, what is extracting that oxygen? And let's just think about what's happening as oxygen, the oxygen-rich blood from our hemoglobin is passing through our capillaries to the active muscles. Where is that oxygen going? Well, it goes to our mitochondria, all right? So our mitochondria, they're going to require a gradient. They need to have basically a VO₂ gradient of, so a delta change or so of, we'll say 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury. Versus your up here at when you first get the blood from your arterial system, you're talking about, if we go through the oxygen cascade is what we'd be talking about, at your blood O2 levels, when you first get your O2 levels, the millimeters of mercury of your blood is millimeters of mercury is around 100 milliliters of mercury. That's what your PaO2 is. Okay, is 100 milliliters of mercury. And then it's typically going to go down at rest to about 40. Actually, I'm going to write, let's see, I'll write your PvO2 is around 40 milliliters of mercury. And that's going to be at basically just at rest. Okay. Now, so this is at rest. And now, let's say during our exercise, your PvO2, that can drop quite low. We can say it can go down to 10 to 20 millimeters of mercury during closer to max exercise. And the lower it goes, the harder it is to extract the oxygen, because it's hard to go super low because you are producing a lot of CO2, and that CO2 is doing what? It's creating a lot of acid, a lot of carbonic acid. And that acid is going to make you feel fatigued, make you feel tired. Also, though, that CO2 is binding onto the hemoglobin and causing the Bohr effect, that shift of the hemoglobin curve, so that you can release more of that oxygen so that you can deliver more oxygen to the mitochondria. The mitochondria only needs like 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury of a pressure gradient. So the mitochondria is the very lowest here, so there's always enough pressure pretty much to drive oxidative phosphorylation of the mitochondria. Now, at rest though, you're at 100 milliliters of mercury, or 95, 100 milliliters of mercury, and then you go down to 40. That equates to this idea over here. There's just different units, right? You're at 20 milliliters per deciliter. I'm going to put per deciliter here, per deciliter. And then it goes down to 15 milliliters per deciliter. Now, somebody who is, again, they're not very well trained, that blood goes through their capillaries and goes past the mitochondria, but the mitochondria doesn't have the ability to use the available oxygen or use as much of it. It's using some of it, using as much as it can, but there's not a lot of mitochondria in those cells. Maybe it's a fraction of the amount of mitochondria that the elite trained endurance athlete has, and so they can only take so much. They can only take, let's say, the 8 milliliters, right? The untrained person is only 8 milliliters, and so same thing here. This is again kind of the elite level, but the sedentary person might only be around 30 to 40 milliliters of mercury. They're not able to extract very much of that oxygen because they don't have very well functioning mitochondria. This is why we talk about the peripheral limited. So their VO2 max is largely peripherally limited. And if they had better functioning mitochondria, then they could drive this extraction and consume pretty much all the oxygen that was delivered to them. But they're not able to. And this is a key point, is again going back to this idea of like providing hyperoxia and extra oxygen and doing all these extra things for these untrained individuals. It's not really going to happen. It's not really going to help them. Why is it not going to help them? It's not going to help them because they already have a lot of oxygen present. Look at this. They're only extracting around 8 milliliters of oxygen, whereas the elite is extracting 18 milliliters of oxygen. So the elite is extracting pretty much all the oxygen that's being given to them. The sedentary person, there's still a lot of oxygen. You can see that both in the partial pressure gradients. The sedentary person, there's still lots of partial pressure gradient of the oxygen. They're not using it. We can even look at the XL, the fraction of oxygen. During the, let's do this. The FiO2 is 21%, right? 21%. That's the atmosphere that we're breathing is 21%. What is the FeO2? The fraction of expired O2, right? So if the fraction of inspired O2 is 21%, how much are we actually exhaling of oxygen? Well, at rest, it's about 16%. And guess what? At exercise, it's around 16% as well. It's a little bit of a U-shaped curve. You're kind of like this. But you have plenty of oxygen. And this is because you're still using more oxygen, of course, because you're starting to hyperventilate. And that also goes to show that if you need more oxygen, you just breathe more. You just hyperventilate more, increase your ventilation, and you're able to breathe more oxygen. And your fraction of expired oxygen, though, is still up pretty high, around 16%. In certain cases, it can go down to like 12, 13% with like high-level athletes. But then even at that their maximal level, it goes back to 16% because they're hyperventilating because they're producing so much CO2 that they're trying to get rid of the CO2. So that's causing a drive for hyperventilation. And that brings their fraction of expired oxygen back up to 16%. But again, it's just showing that there's a lot of unused oxygen specifically for the sedentary individuals or the people who are just not super elite levelly trained because they are peripherally limited. They do not have the ability to extract the oxygen. Why? Because they do not have high functioning mitochondria or high mitochondrial density or the capillary density, for example. Now, with elite athletes, you might question, well, how come this partial pressure gradient doesn't just drop to zero? Like, how come they can't just use all the oxygen immediately? Well, they are using pretty much all the oxygen they can, but if they were to use to basically the mitochondria consume all the oxygen, so the partial pressure of oxygen drops to zero, then immediately what would happen? The oxidative phosphorylation of the mitochondria would stop, the ATP production would stop, and then it would just be catastrophic because all of a sudden they're just like, and they can't move anymore. Because remember, when you run out of ATP, what happens? You get rigor mortis, right? That because the ATP is what needs to bind to the myosin heads to release the actin filaments. And if all of a sudden you just stopped your oxidative phosphorylation because you totally ran out of oxygen, that's what would happen. So it'd be totally a catastrophe. But that's not what happens, because you start to exercise, push yourself harder and harder and harder. It becomes increasingly more difficult to extract the oxygen from the hemoglobin. Oh, and then you have myoglobin that's stored into your muscles, which elite level athletes have more myoglobin stored in their muscles that can basically grab onto the oxygen or can release their oxygen once the hemoglobin levels falls really, really low, and it can sustain some more activity, for 5-10 seconds or so. But that's enough to get that elite athlete to do a little sprint, just push a little bit harder. But those other fatigue mechanisms set in, and before their mitochondria just totally stop because the oxygen's run out, right? So as you get lower in oxygen, you start doing more and more anaerobic metabolism. Glycolysis starts to increase, and as the glycolysis starts to increase, now you start having an increase in inorganic phosphate and calcium ions, and so all those things leading to fatigue, so that you cannot continue exercise anymore. So those fatigue things set in, preventing you from running totally out of oxygen and having total catastrophic situation, right? So when it comes to oxygen, what's extracting the ability to extract oxygen? It's about your mitochondrial density, right? So your mitochondrial, we could say function. Okay, function, and as well as density. But then other things like your capillaries, your capillary density. And then we can zoom in on the mitochondria even more, and you have things like, what about your mitochondrial enzymes themselves? How well can they work? Your fiber types, remember type 1 muscle fibers have more mitochondria. You have how much myoglobin do you have? Your local blood flow distribution, to those active muscles. The transit time with your red blood cells, like how long does it take to go through the muscles. Then of course your diffusion gradients that we talked about, and as well as the VO₂ gradients. These are all the things that are going to determine how well you can extract that oxygen. And again, it's helping us to separate between the central limited factor as well as the peripheral factors. When you first start training, okay, so you're a sedentary individual and you're going to first start training, your VO₂ max is going to increase. Well, what is going to happen first? Well, the first thing is your cardiac output will start to increase because you will start to improve your stroke volume. The stroke volume is going to increase because you start to increase your plasma volume. And as your plasma volume increases, your end-diastolic volume increases, the stroke volume increases, your cardiac output increases. So those are the first things that are the most adaptable and trainable at the early stages. And then longer term, as you continue to train, what's going to happen? You'll have more mitochondrial function, a greater density, and more capillaries. Then you'll have more oxygen extraction, right? And then as well as you improve like your whole running economy. With your elite athletes, these guys have already, and girls, your elite athletes, they've already maximized basically this ability of peripheral extraction. And that's why they benefit so much from things like blood doping, EPO, hyperoxia, because you give them oxygen, their mitochondria are using it. If you give those things to the sedentary individuals, it'll help them a little bit, especially if it's going to help with the stroke volume or something, but it doesn't help them near as much because again, they already have plenty of oxygen. Their mitochondria aren't good enough to use it. And so with the elite levels, what they need is they need more hemoglobin mass. How do you get more hemoglobin mass besides blood doping and things? By doing these long trainings and getting you increase your plasma volume so you don't increase hemoglobin the concentration too much. You improve your pulmonary saturation. That's when like hyperoxia can happen. Because this is very interesting. If you have a really high cardiac output, a really high stroke volume, your elite level athletes, they can actually have exercise-induced hypoxemia. In other words, their heart pumps so hard that the blood goes across the capillaries and their lungs so quickly that the oxygen doesn't fully diffuse and dissolve into the blood. And so instead of having an SpO2 of 100%, 95%, it could be like below 90, 88%. And that's kind of an indicator that these athletes are probably centrally limited because they're not delivering as much oxygen, and that's why they benefit so much from hyperoxia or from additional hemoglobin mass versus, again, your sedentary individuals. They're not benefiting near as much because they already have plenty of oxygen available. They're just not able to use as much of it. So your VO2 max, right? It is determined by how much oxygen can be delivered to the mitochondria and how completely the mitochondria can extract it can extract that oxygen for its own use, right? That's what makes your VO2 critical for health. And now, this is really important to understand because when it comes to exercise in general, we know that exercise is going to improve your things like your blood pressure, your glycemic control, right? Your muscles uptaking that glucose, your inflammatory response, endothelial function, your body composition, especially if you're lifting weights. And that's why if you meet the physical activity guidelines, that's associated with like a 20 to 30% lower risk in all-cause mortality. That's huge, a 20 to 30% lower risk. Now, on top of that, as you increase your cardiorespiratory fitness, specifically your VO2 max, every one metabolic equivalent of task or MET, which is about 3.5 milliliters per minute per kilogram of VO2, every one increase is an additional 10 to 15% reduction in mortality risk. So think about that. Every one MET improvement, 3.5. So if you say have a VO2 max of say 30 and you go to 33.5, 34, you have another 10 to 15% reduction in mortality risk. So we really care both about doing the exercise consistently and how much fitness adaptation your body's going to gain after that. If you think about somebody who has a VO2 max of 60, 70, they have a much higher longevity, but it's good for them to continue exercising daily because you get those adaptations, you get benefits, those acute effects as well, right? So when we put all this together, it's like exercise truly is the medicine, and fitness is basically how strong your body is going to get gains from that medicine. So taking the medicine consistently helps, but responding strongly even helps even more. And that's why you want to exercise daily. And as you exercise daily, hopefully you make these adaptations that we've talked about with your improved endocyte volume, your stroke volume, your improved extraction ability because you have improved mitochondrial function. And as you do all of that, you continue getting your VO2 higher and higher, and you continue getting all these benefits. And so your risk for all-cause mortality drastically decreases.